Well, hello everyone again. I'm Phillip Johnson, Executive Director of Oregon Shores, with the very challenging task of covering our 50-year history in a brief space. It's particularly challenging, I'd like to actually start with an apology. It's challenging to cover Oregon Shores history for a couple of reasons. One is that the people that founded Oregon Shores were doers, not necessarily record keepers, and they were extremely busy. Looking back at the things they accomplished, all as volunteers is amazing. And they were busy doing that and not keeping records. So I've had to piece together some of our history from fairly fragmentary sources. So I may overlook some important things that way. Also, there's simply been so many people that have contributed to Oregon Shores over all these many years, dozens and dozens of board members, hundreds of volunteers. So there's some things I don't know about, but I can't possibly cover everything I do. So I just sort of want to issue a blanket apology if you're one of the people that's listening in that's made major contributions and they don't happen to get mentioned, but everyone who's contributed through these 50 years has created the organization we have today and is remembered and appreciated. So with that, we're the Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition. The name's actually a little anachronistic in that we've over the decades, we've expanded our focus so that we now like to say we cover everything from the crest of the coastal mountains to the edge of the continental shelf. But initially, the very first focus was the beaches. And so I'm going to try and give a 1-minute history of Oregon's public beaches leading to the foundation of Oregon Shores. In Oregon's history and its Aboriginal history, the beach was the route you took north and south. For thousands of years, tribal peoples traveled up and down the river valleys and then up and down the coast on the beach or by canoe offshore. You didn't go overland across the rugged mountains in those days. And when pioneers settled the shoreline, and with a very sad story of the way the native peoples were extirpated to make that happen, but when they then took over the much of the shoreline, they traveled north and south through horses and then later through cars. But the beach was a highway well up into this century, which gave this man, Governor Oswald West, here he is, in 1913, a brilliant idea. He simply added a clause to that year's highway funding bill declaring that the beach was a right-of-way. And that made sense to everybody because nobody wanted the people to be putting barriers across, blocking the US mails or something. So even a Republican-dominated legislature, not realizing they were favoring public land over private, passed this bill, and people didn't realize for decades that he thereby prevented any development ever on the beaches and kept them open as public rights-of-way. Well, of course, access to the shoreline is critical too, and for a lot of that, we owe a great debt to this man, Sam Boardman, who was not only our first Parks Department director, he created the Parks Department from nothing. Sam Boardman took an assignment to just inventory the state's pullouts along highways into creating what was then the Parks Division of the Highway Department. He had just no budget. He spent decades from the late 20s on into the 50s traveling up and down all over the state, but especially on the coast and along the Columbia River, because he had almost no money to buy land. So his idea was to buy access points so you get people out to the beaches or out to the riverbank where they could then have a lot of access. And so he's primarily responsible for that necklace of 66 parks and waysides that we've got up and down the coast. And he achieved that with just no money by buying land after it had been cut over for a dime on the dollar, with the vision to realize that 75, 100 years later, it would be beautiful. So for instance, there's Cape Blanco when he acquired it in 1936. So for decades, there was very little development on the coast. It was fairly remote, and people were content with what everybody thought of as our open public coastline. Until 1967, when, as development was really increasing and there were demands for tourist facilities, the owner of the Surf Sand Motel in Cannon Beach attempted to partition off part of his beach for the exclusive use of his customers. And that sparked what became the Beach Bill, the campaign for the Beach Bill. It brought in two iconic figures of Oregon history, one being legendary Governor Tom McCall, you see there in a carefully posed photo as he he glares at the surf sand, and it's the area it's blocked off. And the other being his rival and friend, Bob Straub, who became governor after McCall, as you see them together here. McCall was a Republican, Straub was a Democrat, and they ran against each other, but they were also friends, and people called them the Tom and Bob show. And both of them threw their weight behind creating public beaches. However, the reason they did was first because of a grassroots push that was stimulated by this man, one of our founders, Bob Bacon, Dr. Bob Bacon, who loved the coast and had a cabin there and was outraged at the idea of shutting off beaches. The claim by the owner being, well, Oz West had protected the dry sand, but not the wet, or I mean the other way around, the wet sand, but not the dry sand. So Bob Bacon founded, with many others, the Citizens to Save Oregon's Beaches. And they were pushing for a bill that would declare the entire beach to be public, not getting very far against a conservative Republican legislature until, and then that's when Tom McCall and Bob Straub weighed in, and they gave it the kind of visibility that created a great public outcry, and the beach bill was passed, making the entire beach a public recreation zone up to the 16-foot contour line. Bob Straub wanted to go further and actually buy the beach because there were property lines under the beach. And so he wanted to quiet that title. So he started a campaign to actually purchase all the state's beaches, Measure 6 in 1968. And this is a photograph from that campaign. Sadly, he was going to fund it with gas taxes, and the oil and gas industry managed to have a multi-million-dollar campaign and shut it down. So that's still kind of a legal question that haunts us a little bit. But anyway, we had our public beaches, and a group of people that had worked to create the beach bill began to talk about the need for a public interest group that would be the watchdog for those beaches. So that included, again, Bob Bacon with his wife, Irene, you see here, many, many decades ago. And here's another photo of Bob Bacon again at the 35th anniversary of Oregon Shores, which he'd helped to found. The other key founders were Ken Fitzgerald, who was, of all things, a Grange director, but it made him a good organizer, and he was passionate about the beaches. And third key person is George Deal. And I have a footnote here. I mean, I've been saying George Deal for literally decades, but apparently Jesse's heard two people just lately say, no, it should be pronounced Dial. So if I've been mispronouncing the name of our founder, my apologies, but I'm going to stick with Deal. Anyway, the Oregon Shores legend, you might say, has always been that the, I'm sorry, and this here is a photo that Jesse just took today of the monument to Dr. Deal or Dial at Manhattan Beach, where we just had a beach walk today. So the legend, Oregon Shores legend, had always been that Oregon Shores was founded at Bob Bacon's kitchen table. I never knew if it was actually a legend or not, but just recently I confirmed with his daughter, Barbara Bacon Folon, that that indeed the conversations that led to the founding of Oregon Shores were actually at their family's kitchen table. So the three launched Oregon Shores, and George Deal, who had just retired as the spokesperson for the state Board of Higher Education, became the volunteer executive director. And he indefatigably attended meetings and wrote letters, and he gave Oregon Shores a major presence by serving as our unpaid executive director all during the 70s. One of the first things that Oregon Shores actually got involved in was the creation of our land use planning laws. Oregon Shores actually predates. We've been doing land use planning since before the land use planning system. And in fact, two of our original board members, including this man that we just saw a minute ago, to bring him back, Steve Shell, take this photo taken many years later, decades later, and Ann Squire left the Oregon Shores Board to become two of the first commissioners of the Land Conservation and Development Commission, which was created by Senate Bill 100, which first created our land use laws. And they were instrumental in creating the system of land use goals, which governs us to this day, including the 4 coastal goals. The last 4 are for estuaries, shorelands, beaches and dunes, and the territorial sea. And we have been working assiduously with those goals ever since. Steve came back on the Oregon Shores Board right after his stint with LCDC and served for 30 years on the board. Anne didn't come back immediately, but did return to the board later on in the late 90s. In the 90s and early part of this century, she was our treasurer for a while. Steve, being a land use attorney himself and being a natural resources expert who was a professor at Lewis and Clark Law School and natural resources advisor to Governor Barbara Roberts, among many other things. As I was trying to put this together, I realized there were three difficulties in telling Oregon Shore's story, aside from the fact just there is so much of it to tell. One is that we've been involved in so many issues. As I say, we have made great use of that land use planning system. More than a decade ago, Steve, this as we see here, did a study and pulled together all the citations of court cases that Oregon Shores had been involved in, important enough that they were cited as precedent-setting cases. And he came up with 40, and that was a while ago, so there's far more than that. And those are just the ones that are significant enough to receive citations. So Oregon Shores has been involved in dozens of issues, so that's hard to keep up with. One of the things that makes it a little hard to keep up with is, or to portray, is so many of the issues that we've dealt with didn't have a really satisfying ultimate outcome of blocking development and saying, here, we save this place. It was more a matter of modifying development to get setbacks and height limitations, and especially to protect wetlands. A lot of what Oregon Shores did in the 70s, and issue after issue, was not necessarily totally block development, but force development to go around wetlands and save important pieces of the coastal environment that way. A couple of the board members that were really active in that are Jack Broom, here with his wife Althea, community activist in her own right. He's the Bee and Bura Architects, and was again, you see his name all over the wetlands issues that we were fighting back then. And also Neil Main, you'll see here in his natural habitat. Neil was a high school biology teacher at the time, and again, very active in issue after issue. Then Jack Broom went on to found the Wetlands Conservancy, which is with us to this day, and an important organization. And Neil left to found the North Coast Land Conservancy, which again is with us and thriving today. He directed it for many years. He's now finally in his element as a stellar coastal photographer. And then George Kyle himself, I know, was very active on wetlands issues and just continually dogged the Corps of Engineers and the state's DEQ and local planning boards on those issues. The third reason that it could be, oh yeah, that's right. Thanks for the reminder. Yeah, I just chose this photo to sort of illustrate all the wetlands we saved. I did not have any of the ones that were issues back in the 70s or 80s. This is one we've been working to save more recently on the North Spit of Coos Bay, which would be damaged by the Jordan Cove LNG plant if it's ever built, which we have spent, again, more than a decade trying to block. As I started to say, the third reason is it's difficult to tell our story is that we worked almost always in partnership with other groups. There's very few issues where you can say, we did this with certainly with local groups. Almost any issue we were involved in, there were local groups that we then supported, and sometimes fellow statewide groups. So there are many hands involved in almost any land use victory. And so just to give you one example, when I first joined the board, just in the first meetings I was at, people were talking happily about the successful conclusion of the battle to save Coquille Point in Bandon. And all I knew was our role in it, and I thought of it as, I see, skip Coquille Point. Well, never mind. You won't see it, but I'd always thought that we'd thought of us as having saved Coquille Point, and doing some research for this talk, I realized what a substantial local effort there was pushing it, and we played a helpful role in it by being the statewide group that came in and testified and provided some statewide visibility. But clearly we were just one of many that worked on that, and that's true of so many things we worked on. One thing that was characterized the 70s, not something so much an issue, or not an issue we worked on in recent decades, but back then there were few protections for headlands, and many of them were quarried and were at risk of just being ground away by mining and quarrying. And we worked on several, successfully worked on several, one of which was saving Yaquina Head, which you see here. And again, I'm aware there's a strong local opposition that we joined. Also, we were active in saving Cape Kiwanda from the same fate. Next slide. And nope, backwards. We're back to the wetlands, not on the headlands. Cape Kiwanda as another one. And then thirdly, one of my favorite places on the coast, Sisters Rocks, down in Curry County was one that we'd worked on. So that's an issue we don't see as much anymore. Whereas wetlands, as we've been talking about, is something we work on continually to this day. Pollution issues, Oregon Shores is very active in opposing use of 7 and other pollutants that were affecting estuaries. And again, we still have issues of estuarine water quality to this day. 2 really major landscape successes Oregon Shores had early on were, and again, working with many others, protecting Cascade Head, and very significantly, protecting South Slough, a branch of the Coos Bay Estuary, which is now the South Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve. And the director of the Oregon Institute of Marine Biology at Charleston, Dr. Paul Rudy, Jerry Rudy as he was known familiarly, was on the Oregon Shores board and led the charge to protect South Slough, which for decades now has been a National Estuarine Research Reserve and a real adornment to the Coos Bay community and a real economic booster of it as well. Another issue that people worked on right at the beginning and we are working on to this day is beach driving. One of the George Deal's initial concerns is his daughter told me recently had been beach driving, people driving up and down Rockaway where he lived, the Rockaway Beach. As I mentioned, Ken Fitzgerald, his big issue was, let's stop those clam crushers was his big line. And we worked with some success early on, but for decades, we haven't really gotten anywhere. I don't think there's anything I hear more often from our members is there anything you can do about those vehicles on the beach? And no, we've managed to hold the line and not allow any more use of beaches by vehicles, but we have not until just this year had any successes. This year, for the first time, actually, we, Surfrider and other local advocates persuaded the state parks to close some of the beach near Pacific City. So there's some relief from vehicles there, and that's a first in my long experience with Oregon Shores that we succeeded at anything with an issue like that. One more issue that we dealt with that was dealt with in the 70s and 80s, and we are dealing with to this day is shoreline armoring, riprapping, and so on. It's to benefit private property, it damages the public beach. We oppose excessive riprapping long ago. We oppose it to this day. We're in the middle of some issues involving riprapping right now, and that's something that'll be carrying us on into our next 50 years. So as we move into the 80s and 90s, that first, you might say, generation of Oregon Shores leaders had departed. I mentioned Jack Broom left for the Wetlands Conservancy, Neil Main for NCLC. George Deal passed away in 1980, and leadership passed on to this remarkable couple, Marguerite and Howard Watkins. Marguerite was just a warrior for the League of Women Voters, and she served on statewide panels and fought to protect especially water quality, but to protect the environment for decades. Howard, her husband, was her staunch support, and they took turns being president of Oregon Shores back in the 80s, and Marguerite was volunteer executive director back then, led many struggles. You see there's someone else there on the porch with them. He looks a little bit like me and he has the same name, but it can't be me because I was never that young. But anyway, Marguerite and Howard provided a lot of leadership for years. I miss them to this day. Howard, on his 100th birthday, celebrated by soloing in a biplane. He was a retired Air Force colonel, had flown every other kind of plane, and on his 100th birthday, he flew a biplane solo. Among the things that they successfully worked on was, in fact, a Clean Water Act lawsuit against Weyerhaeuser on the North Spit, an area which now, 40 years later, 30 plus years later, we're working to protect from the LNG plant. Another key issue, key success, was the creation of what's now called the 804 Trail, which takes its name from having been County Road 804, which had been a county road in the early days back when the beach had been a public highway. It's a place where the beach came up against Rocky Headland, and the county had built a road which had long since been abandoned, and developers wanted to get it vacated and build on it. And once again, with dedicated local citizens, we worked for years to prevent that from happening, and wound up with one of the coast's most beautiful trail, one of the best places to actually observe, especially rocky shorelines, just from going north from Yachats. One of our board members and a board member of the local group that led that charge was Charlotte Mills. You'll see here, and who just was passionate on that subject and in general about protecting the Yachats area for a long time, and served on our board for a long time. And just here's another of our early board members, Peter Frank, at the sign, what was then the brand new sign for that 804 Trail. Another outright triumph, there's all too few of those when you can say, yes, we did this, but one is the protection of Fishing Rock in the Gleneden Beach area, which was threatened by a wall of condos, and instead is a really beautiful small state park there. You've heard this before, working with a local group, but Oregon Shores took the lead role in protecting that. As we move on into the 90s, I don't have a photo, unfortunately, because she's the person behind a lot of the photos you've been seeing of our early board members. But Fran Recht was a key figure in that period, first as conservation director and then as president. And like those people in the 70s, just tirelessly, attended meetings, wrote testimony, made herself a land use expert, the equal of the land use attorneys we were up against. Actually, very close to the end of her tenure, and at the very last board meeting I attended as a board member, we did something which I imagine Fran would agree is one of the best things we ever did for the coast, which was advocated for the creation of the Coastal Law Project, which is a partnership we have with the Craig Law Center and have had now for well over 15 years. It has been absolutely critical to our work and has made us just far more effective. So, I think we would both say that was a really good move back then. That's the point at which Oregon Shores finally became staffed. All the work I've been describing to you up to now is done purely by volunteers, but we've taken on so much, and it's had such an ambitious mission that we did finally go staff. And a couple of the key things that we achieved during those years, the first part of this century, have been, go back, Crook Point, which this is one of those cases where it's not developed now, and we've won many appeals that have kept it from being developed into a golf resort. We can't say that it's over. Environmental issues will never be over until 5 billion years from now, when the sun hyperinflates and burns the earth to a crisp. And I suspect that there will be intergalactic developers who will be then trying to market the resulting carbon. But so for now, we've managed to protect this really one of the most magnificent places on the coast. That's the Mac Arch Archipelago, just offshore from Crook Point. And another very fortunate triumph is our success with local support, of course, in preventing development of another golf resort on the spit enclosing the lake estuary. And instead, after a long battle, the would-be developer gave up and sold it to the public, and it is now the Sitka Sedge State Natural Area, just between Pacific City and no, I should take that back, just north of Tierra del Mar, which turns north of Pacific City. As we went to staffing, Sylvia Shaw was our first executive director, and Robin Hartman, who had been on the board, then became our actual ocean program director, and led us for a decade-long struggle to create the marine reserves we have off the Oregon coast. and here again with many allies, but we were one of the three groups that initially founded the coalition that pushed for a long time to get the 5 Marine reserves we have. Robin was both our representative to that and served on the state's Ocean Policy Advisory Council and played a key role in all that, something we continue to work on. We're part of the Oregon Marine Reserves Partnership, and those reserves are coming up for review, and we'll be very active in that. You know, and for myself, I'd been on the board, and I became the Coast Watch director at this point, which leads me to wind back a bit. Another key thing that happened in the 90s was the creation of Coast Watch in 1993. So it's more than 25 years old now. Initially, it was the idea was more as an early warning system for possible issues of development, you know, land use issues, riprapping, things like that. So we were thinking based more inland when we originally thought of Coast Watch. Over the years, it is more and more focused instead on the shoreline itself and on natural history, and it's become our way not only of tracking impacts to the shoreline, but of teaching people about coastal resources. And so it's become a key educational tool for many years. Fawn Custer, who we'll see here, leading a Coast Watch training session, went up and down the coast, not only training people to watch Coast Watch miles, but telling them about coastal natural history. Fawn continues with us as our citizen science trainer. And Coast Watch over the years is increasingly focused on citizen science and such things as sea stars, marine mammals, beach birds, and marine debris. You see here a student group working on our marine debris survey. Well, that kind of brings it full circle. So we'll go back to Bob Bacon, who founded the Oregon Shores, along with other people in 1971, 50 years ago to this day. There's much we could say about what we've been doing lately. We could talk about Jordan Cove. We could talk about the work we've been doing, led by our current volunteer coordinator, Jesse Jones, and board members to work on the protection of rocky shore habitat. We could talk about our work on estuaries, eelgrass. We'll talk about our work trying to defend the integrity of our shoreline against inappropriate riprap. I won't say much about that, though. That's in preparing this, I found myself thinking of a book I read decades ago. Nothing relevant to what we're talking about here at all, by Moss Hart. It'll only be familiar to those of you if you're theater fans. He was a leading figure of the American theater from the late 20s all the way up into the 60s. He wrote this very good biography named Act One, which is just about how he got there. And it just describes his childhood of extreme poverty and how he clawed his way up into the theater. And it concludes with the first play that he'd co-written with George S. Kaufman, becoming a big success on Broadway, and his driving by the theater in a cab and seeing people lined up to see his play with his name in the marquee. And then he stops there and he says, he's not going to write anymore. He doesn't need to tell the rest of the story. And he said, and I'm remembering from decades ago, so this is an exact quote, but it's always stuck with me. He said, it's not really interesting to talk about people's success. Those stories are pretty much all the same. What's interesting is to talk about how they got there. So I've kept that in mind. So this talk has been how we got here. And while I don't necessarily agree with Moss Hart about the current successes not being an interesting story, there's lots we can say about the work we're doing now and our plans for the next 50 years. But for now, we're just honoring that 50-year history that got us here, and all those amazing people that did so much, including, again, Bob Bacon we see here, and Bob Straub that he's talking to at the 30th anniversary of the Beach Bill, the celebration that Oregon Shores organized in front of the surf sand. So in putting this together, I've been remembering dozens and dozens of people, including people I worked with. There's a little tear in the eye thinking about Marguerite and Howard Watkins, Jack Broom, Bob Bacon, Bob and Ellen Waring, other really extraordinary people that I've had a chance to work with, all part of the story that's led us to this point. And this is the culmination of that 50-year history. And tomorrow we start the first day of our next 50 years. And I hope you will be, many of you will be joining us on that journey. So with that, I will wind up, and I think we're have a little time if there are any questions from the audience about our history that I can answer right now.